In this unit, we're going to discuss users and groups and user management. We're going to start in the first module, keeping it simple with the built-in user management within Linux. And then in lesson 2, which will be in the second portion of this module, we're going to talk in more depth about some more enterprise-wide user management with which Linux can interface. So we'll dive a lot deeper in the second part of the module. The first part of the module, a lot of this may be material you've already been exposed to in other Linux courses or just through day-to-day use of Linux. So let's get started. When we talk about user accounts, the most important user account is going to be the root. So root is basically the system administrator for your Linux system. So the root can do everything. It has access to everything. Therefore, it's also a very dangerous account, right? Because it can access anything on that system. Anytime you have a Linux system, there always has to be a root account. It's going to be created automatically when the kernel is first installed. And then you'll have that root account. You'll always set that password. If you're using the cloud environment, usually it'll ask you what you want the root password to be when it deploys a server in the cloud. So you'll always have to know what that root password is. If you lose the root password, it can be very difficult, especially with cloud-based systems, to get access to it, to get unfettered access back into the system. Some Debian distros, the root password is randomly generated and not given to any user. This is for distros that are really a GUI-based distro that's going to be installed on a desktop. But for the most part, for system administrators, when we're working with Linux, for servers and VMs and things like that, we're almost always going to have access to that root password when we do the installation or when we deploy a system. But when you do use one of those desktop-based systems, you can always use sudo to reset the root password. So root has access to all the files, can execute every single command. There is nothing that root cannot do. Normal user accounts are accounts for people and for daemons and things like that. Generally, when you create a user account for people, they're going to have a home directory. It's going to have some initial files in it. You're going to configure a shell that's used with that account and so forth. Some of the things that we'll talk about. Software accounts are used because some software need to run under their own home directory with their own access rights that are different from a user, right? So they can't run under a user context. They have to run within their own context. So you'll also have software accounts or service accounts. You'll frequently hear this referred to as service accounts in Linux and in other operating systems like Windows. So these are basically attributes about user accounts. You'll find all this information in the password file, which is under etc, of course, and then there's a shadow file for the passwords. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. So in this course, we're going to use command line tools to manage user accounts. We don't use the GUI. So user add and new users are two commands you can use for creating new accounts, and then group add is used for creating group accounts. To use a lot of these commands I'm going to talk about, it's probably easiest to log in to your system as root using the su command. So you're going to connect to your machine using your standard user, and then you can drop to a root command prompt by using the su or super user command. If you don't know the root password, you can always use sudo if you have to, but hopefully for your machines in the labs, you all should know the root password to run the su command. So the first command that we'll talk about is user add. Again, this is one you hopefully have been exposed to prior to this course. This is a little bit of a rehash of what you would have learned previously, but when you run the user add command, there's some options that you can pass in, and then you pass it the username. So this is a two-step process usually for creating user accounts with this command. User add will create the account along with some options. You might have it do some different things, but this will create the user account. Then you have to use the passwd command to set the user's password. So I'll show you in the next two slides here some of the options available for the user add command. If you're adding, by the way, if you're adding a lot of users, there are some other tools that might work better, and certainly other ways to manage user accounts. I think it's pretty rare that we see people setting up hundreds of users on Linux anymore. It really doesn't make a lot of sense to have all those user accounts on a Linux machine. We usually use something like LDAP or Active Directory or something like that, or we integrate with some login system for that kind of thing. But these are some of the options for the user add command. You've got -C to add a comment, -D to set the user's home directory if you don't want it to be the default, and so forth and so on. So and you can also create put them in a default group instead of creating their own private group. So just a couple different options here for the command. And these are some additional options, and again, these are all enumerated in your textbook. So aside from using options to change defaults, you can modify the system defaults You can use -D to view what the defaults are, and you can use the D option to change a particular default. So the defaults are shown in your textbook. So for example, Skell is the default skeleton directory. We'll cover this later when we talk about some of the configuration files for user accounts in the Etsy directory. One of those is Skell, which contains the default folders, or I'm sorry, directories and files that are put in the user's home directory when you create new accounts. So here are some of the options that I was referring to. So in creating a user account, a new entry is always going to be added to the password file, right? PASSWD, short for password. And then it'll also create their password will be in the shadow file. Remember, the password file doesn't actually contain passwords. It just contains information about the user account because it's readable by everyone. There are lots of reasons that everyone, might need to see that file, but we don't want to have their encrypted password available for anyone to see. Even though it's encrypted, you still don't want to expose it because someone could brute force to figure out what the password is, so it's considered a security risk to allow people to see that. So instead, we use the shadow password or the shadow file for the actual password hash, and that is protected from read access, so only the root can see that file. If the user account has a private group, an entry would also be added in the Etsy group file, and there's also a shadow file for groups as well, if there is a password set for the group. So when we cover permissions, we explored the role of a group. We're going to talk about permissions in a little bit more detail later in the course, but by default, the user is given their own private group, and by default, any new file or directory created by the user is assigned their ownership and to their private group. But you could also put groups into, or put users into groups that contain many users, right? They can also be added to other groups. But by default, their primary group will always be that private group that gets created by default. You can create additional groups using the group add command. And this is, again, useful for administrative purposes, for administratively managing user accounts by placing them into groups. This is something most of you are probably familiar with. And if you've had any exposure to Microsoft Windows Active Directory, you're probably intimately familiar with why we use groups and why groups help with administration. So if you need to create a lot of user accounts, one option is to use the user add command, and you can just keep recalling and editing the options to add more user accounts. So that's certainly one way you could add a lot of user accounts. But we just learned about shell scripting, right? To automate things that we have to do, menial tasks, repetitive tasks, right? Shell scripting is all about automation. So if you do have to add a lot of accounts, that's a perfect job for shell scripts, right? So, all that stuff that we learned in the previous module, you could use that to write a little script that creates user accounts, maybe from a text file. It could read all the the usernames or information about users from a text file and automatically create those accounts. And there's lots of other ways you could do it too, right? Use flat files, XML files, read them out of Active Directory if you wanted to, all kinds of options. And so here's another example of using a shell script to automate. This one augments the previous one by also setting the default shell. And you can see here you could add other options when adding user accounts. The new user command is another option. Instead of using user add, you can use new users. This one allows you to read user accounts from a flat file. So it requires a certain format, which you see there. So you basically create a flat file that has all the usernames, their password, the UID, group ID, a comment, directory, shell. You don't have to populate all of those fields. You just leave it blank. So for example, if all you have is a username and password, and you don't want to set any of the other options, you can just leave those blank. You still have to put the semicolon or the colons in. So it has the right number of delimiters, but you don't actually have to have a value for all those. I believe the only ones required is going to be the username, I think, is the only one that's required, but I'm not 100% sure. But I think you can leave everything else blank if you wanted to. If you leave the password blank, it just won't set a password. You'll have to go and do that later, right? You'll have to go and set all those passwords. The ID command allows you to look at all these configuration options for a user. So instead of having to go look in the password file, you could type the ID command followed by the user's username, and you can get their UID and their GID or their group ID if you wanted to. So there's some sample output when somebody ran the ID command for user FoxR, which was a user on their system. If you don't provide a username, it's going to respond with whatever the current logged in user is. So whatever your current context is, it'll just return information about you, right? How you're logged into the system. Sometimes it's a nice shorthand way to see if you're logged in as a regular user or root, right? You can type ID and it'll say, oh, you're connected as root. Although usually you can tell from the prompt as well for most systems, unless you don't have your prompt changed. User mod is mostly the same options as user add. It's a way to modify user accounts, right? So you can modify those options, but you can also do that with the add users command. So new users, it's the same as before, but if a username already exists, then the current account is going to be modified if you want to modify using the new users command. User del is for deleting user accounts, but if you add the -r to user del, nice little feature with user del, if you add the -r, it's going to automatically remove both their mail directory and their home directory. So you don't have to go and scrub all that stuff. It'll just do it for you if you add that -r on the command. Oh, and you can also use -f if you want to force deletion, even if the user is currently logged in and running processes. So it'll kick them out and delete all of their stuff. And then this is the last slide. It shows you an example of a script to delete users and shows you some of the exit codes from this command.